At 28,000 feet on K2, the world becomes very simple. There are no rules up there. No police, no judges, no witnesses. Only wind, cold, gravity, and the decisions climbers make when survival is no longer guaranteed. On August 1, 2008, two climbers stood together on the summit of K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, and to many mountaineers, the most dangerous. They had climbed for weeks through ice falls, avalanches, and the thin air of the death zone to reach that point. The sky above them was clear. The Karakoram stretched endlessly in every direction. For a moment, they had everything climbers dream about. One of them was Marco Confortola, an Italian mountain guide known for his confidence and experience in extreme terrain. The other was Gerard McDonnell, an Irish engineer whose quiet determination had already carried him to the summit of Everest. They were friends. They were roped together, and they were standing at the top of one of the most unforgiving mountains on Earth. But K2 has a reputation among climbers. It allows you to reach the summit. Then it tests whether you deserve to come back down. Within hours, the mountain would tear their path apart. And by the time the storm of events ended, only one of them would return to tell the story. For years, the world believed that story. But the mountain had kept another version hidden in the ice. Welcome to K2 Stories. To understand what happened on K2 in the summer of 2008, you have to understand the two men whose paths crossed high above the Karakoram. Marco Confortola grew up in northern Italy, in a small alpine village surrounded by glaciers and steep valleys. In places like that, mountains are not distant scenery. They are part of everyday life. Marco learned to climb early. By his late teens, he had already built a reputation as a talented alpinist, moving quickly over difficult terrain that intimidated most climbers. Eventually, he earned the certification of an international mountain guide, one of the most demanding qualifications in the climbing world. Guides are trained not just to climb, but to rescue others when things go wrong. That reputation followed him throughout the Alps. He worked with the Alpine Rescue Service in Lombardy, flying into remote valleys to help injured climbers or search for those who had not returned. In that world, experience becomes identity. You learn to trust your judgment, your instincts, and your ability to make decisions under pressure. But the Alps, for all their beauty, are relatively accessible. Helicopters can reach most routes. Weather forecasts are reliable. Villages sit only hours away. For ambitious climbers, the true proving ground lies elsewhere, the Himalayas. In the early 2000s, Marco began traveling east, chasing the world's highest peaks. Expeditions to Everest and Annapurna helped build his reputation further. He was confident, determined, and eager to prove himself among the elite climbers who measured success in 8,000-meter summits. Thousands of kilometers away, another climber was following a very different path. Gerard McDonnell, known to most of his friends simply as Gerard's, not raised in the mountains. He grew up in Ireland, a country famous for green hills and ocean storms, rather than high-altitude climbing. By profession, he was an engineer. His approach to mountaineering reflected that background. Where some climbers relied on instinct or bravado, Gerard approached problems with patience and logic. He liked systems, solutions, and teamwork. In the early 2000s, he moved to Alaska for work, and the vast wilderness there transformed his life. Weekends became expeditions. Glaciers replaced office buildings. Over time, the quiet engineer from Ireland developed into a capable high-altitude climber. But what set Gerard apart wasn't just skill.
It was character.
Friends described him as someone who lifted the mood in difficult places. At base camps, he was known for playing traditional Irish music, checking other climbers' equipment, and making sure nobody felt alone during long storms trapped in tents. In 2003, he joined an expedition to Mount Everest. The climb was difficult, but Gerard approached it with humility. When he finally stood on the summit, his reaction was not celebration, but gratitude. He later spoke more about the teamwork of Sherpas and fellow climbers than about the summit itself. For him, mountaineering was not about conquering mountains. It was about sharing the experience. After Everest, Gerard turned his attention toward a much harder objective. If Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, K2 is often considered the most demanding. The slopes are steeper, the weather less predictable, and the margin for error far smaller. In 2006, Gerard attempted K2 for the first time. The mountain nearly ended his journey before it truly began. During the climb, a falling rock struck his helmet, injuring him and forcing an emergency evacuation from the mountain. For many climbers, that experience would have been enough to walk away. Gerard saw it differently. He believed the mountain had unfinished business with him. 2 years later, in 2008, he returned to Pakistan, determined to try again. That summer, dozens of climbers from around the world gathered at K2 base camp. Expeditions from South Korea, Norway, the Netherlands, and several independent teams all waited for the same thing: a narrow window of stable weather. Among the tents scattered across the glacier, Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell met for the first time. They came from different cultures, different careers, and different philosophies of climbing. But high on a mountain, those differences disappear quickly. Both men wanted the same thing: a chance to stand on the summit of K2 and make it safely back down. By late July 2008, the mood at K2 base camp began to shift. For weeks, climbers had been moving slowly up and down the mountain in a process known as acclimatization. They climbed to higher camps during the day, then returned to sleep lower down so their bodies could adapt to the thinning air. Above 8,000 meters, the altitude climbers call the death zone. The human body can no longer recover. Every hour spent there slowly weakens muscles, judgment, and coordination. The only safe strategy is speed. Climb up, reach the summit, get down before the body begins to fail. Weather forecasts finally showed a narrow window at the beginning of August. Winds were expected to drop for a brief period, perhaps just long enough for a summit attempt. On August 1st, climbers from several expeditions began moving upward from Camp 4, the final camp before the summit push. Their headlamps flickered in the darkness as they started climbing shortly after midnight. From below, the line of lights looked like a slow procession of stars moving toward the sky. Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell joined that line. The route they followed was the Abruzzi Spur, the most commonly used path to the summit of K2. But even the standard route on K2 is steep, exposed, and unforgiving. The most dangerous section lies just below the summit ridge. Climbers call it the Bottleneck. The Bottleneck is a narrow couloir of ice that rises steeply toward the summit. Above it hangs a massive overhanging block of glacier ice, known as a serac structure, the size of a building suspended high above the route. To reach the summit of K2, every climber must pass directly beneath it. There is no alternative path. Normally, fixed ropes are installed through this section to help climbers move safely up and down the steep slope. But on this particular day, something had gone wrong. The team responsible for fixing the ropes had started too low on the mountain. By the time climbers reached the steepest part of the bottleneck, the ropes had already run out. The result was a dangerous delay. Dozens of climbers were now stuck in a slow-moving line, waiting for someone ahead of them to install new anchors and extend the ropes higher. Every minute lost in the death zone meant less energy for the descent later. Hours passed. Morning became afternoon. The summit was still above them. In high-altitude mountaineering, there is usually a turnaround time. Fixed hour when climbers must abandon the summit attempt and descend, regardless of how close they are. That rule exists for a reason. Climbing down K2 in darkness is far more dangerous than climbing up. But the summit was now close enough to see, and summit fever, the powerful psychological pull to finish the climb, began to take hold across the mountain. One by one, climbers continued upward. Marco and Gerard moved carefully through the bottleneck and across the exposed traverse beneath the hanging sérac. Above them stretched the final snow slopes leading toward the summit ridge. The sun was already beginning to lower in the sky. By the time they reached the summit ridge, evening light was casting long shadows across the Karakoram. At approximately 7:00 p.m. on August 1, 2008, Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell stepped onto the summit of K2 at 8,000, his 611 meters above sea level. It is a place few humans have ever stood. For Marco, the summit represented another major achievement in a growing mountaineering career. For Gerard, it meant something quieter, proof that the mountain which had nearly ended his life 2 years earlier had not defeated him. But there was very little time to celebrate. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Night was approaching, and far below them, the bottleneck waited, still guarded by that massive block of unstable ice hanging above the route. On K2, the summit is only halfway. The real challenge is coming back down. And on that evening, the mountain was already preparing the next chapter of the story. The descent from K2 began under fading light. After reaching the summit late in the evening, climbers immediately started moving down the narrow ridge toward the bottleneck. Fatigue was now becoming a serious factor. Many had been climbing for nearly 20 hours in thin air, with limited oxygen and almost no rest. At extreme altitude, exhaustion affects more than muscles. Decision-making slows. Reaction time stretches. Even simple movements, clipping a rope, adjusting a harness, can take far longer than normal. Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell were descending among the last climbers leaving the summit. Below them, the bottleneck was already crowded with exhausted climbers trying to make their way down the steep ice slope. Darkness had begun to settle across the mountain. Then at around 8:30 p.m., the mountain changed everything. High above the bottleneck, part of the hanging sérac finally broke loose. A large section of ice collapsed and swept down across the couloir. For the climbers below, the event happened almost instantly. The falling ice tore through the fixed ropes that had been installed earlier that day. Those ropes were the climbers' lifeline. Without them, the steep slope beneath the bottleneck became dramatically more difficult to descend. In seconds, the route that dozens of climbers had used to reach the summit was no longer secure. For the climbers still high on the mountain, the situation was suddenly uncertain. Some continued descending carefully, searching for remaining sections of rope. Others stopped, trying to understand what had happened. Marco and Gerard reached the upper section of the bottleneck and quickly realized the problem. The ropes they had relied on earlier were now damaged or missing. Descending safely would require extreme caution, and night had fully arrived. At that altitude, temperatures can fall far below freezing within minutes after sunset. Wind increases, visibility drops, the body begins losing heat faster than it can produce it. Climbers in this situation sometimes face an option they never planned for: an unplanned night on the mountain. Marco and Gerard were among those forced into that reality. Unable to descend safely through the steep ice in total darkness without reliable ropes, they stopped and prepared to wait for daylight. Using their ice tools and boots, they carved shallow depressions into the snow to shelter themselves from the wind. This type of emergency shelter is sometimes called a snow hole or a bivouac. It offers little protection. There are no tents, no sleeping bags, and no stoves to melt water. But it can reduce exposure just enough to survive the night. Through the long hours of darkness, the mountain remained silent except for the wind moving across the ridge. Marco later described forcing himself to stay awake, moving his hands and feet to maintain circulation and prevent the cold from taking control. At that altitude, Even brief moments of sleep can be dangerous. Gerard remained beside him through the night. By the early hours of the morning on August 2nd, the sky slowly began to brighten over the Karakoram. They had survived the night. But the descent was far from over. As daylight returned, Marco and Gerard climbed out of their snow shelters and looked down the Bottleneck toward the lower camps. What they saw was unexpected. Below them, several climbers from a Korean expedition were caught in a complicated web of damaged ropes left behind after the Serac collapse. The ropes had twisted and tightened during the night, leaving the climbers unable to move freely down the slope. At that altitude, even a simple problem can quickly become dangerous. Marco and Gerard began moving carefully toward them. What followed would become one of the most debated moments in the entire 2008 K2 disaster, an event that would shape how the world remembered both men. When Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell reached the stranded climbers, the situation was complex. Several members of the Korean team had become tangled in damaged fixed ropes during the night. The collapse of the Serac had twisted the lines across the slope, creating a confusing web of anchors and knots. On steep ice at over 8,000 meters, even small obstacles can take enormous effort to solve. Marco and Gerard began working carefully to help. Every movement required concentration. Hands inside thick gloves struggled to manipulate frozen ropes and metal carabiners. The cold slowed their fingers, and the altitude drained their energy with every step. For hours they tried to free the trapped climbers. The problem was not simply untangling knots. The ropes were under tension, holding weight in different directions. Cutting the wrong section could send someone sliding down the steep slope. Untying them required patience, strength, and careful judgment. Time passed slowly. At that altitude, even standing still carries a cost. The body continues losing heat and oxygen while waiting. Eventually, Marco began to feel the cold spreading through his boots and legs. The night without shelter had already pushed his body close to its limits. Later, Marco would explain that he believed the situation had become impossible to solve quickly. From his perspective, remaining there much longer risked losing the ability to descend at all. In the death zone, survival often becomes a series of difficult calculations, balancing the chance of helping others against the need to protect your own ability to get down the mountain. At some point, Marco began descending again. He believed Gerard would follow behind him. But when he looked back later down the slope, the Irish climber was no longer there. The fog of exhaustion, altitude, and stress made the situation difficult to understand in the moment. Marco continued downward toward Camp 4, focusing on placing each step carefully on the steep ice. Hours later, when he finally reached lower camp, his body was severely weakened by cold and exhaustion. Frostbite had already begun to affect his feet. When other climbers asked about Gerard McDonnell, Marco could only give the information he believed to be true at the time, that Gerard had remained higher on the mountain and had not followed. But the story did not end there. High above, other climbers and Sherpas were still moving through the Bottleneck. Their observations, combined with photographs and later testimonies, would gradually reveal a more complete picture of what had happened after Marco descended. Gerard McDonnell had not immediately left the stranded climbers.
Instead, he continued working on the rope system.
Using his engineering mindset, he studied the tension in the lines and realized that the ropes trapping the climbers were anchored higher up the slope. Rather than trying to untangle them directly, he climbed upward to the anchor point and adjusted the system. By relieving the tension, he was able to create slack in the ropes below. That change allowed the trapped climbers to free themselves. For a brief moment, it appeared that the group might successfully descend together toward safety. But K2 is a mountain where conditions can change quickly. Later that morning, another large section of ice broke away from the same unstable serac above the Bottleneck. The avalanche swept across the slope where the climbers were descending. In the aftermath, several climbers against Gerard McDonnell were lost on the mountain. What remained were fragments of memory, scattered testimonies, and the difficult realization that even acts of determination and teamwork cannot always overcome the power of the environment at extreme altitude. The events of that morning would spark years of discussion within the mountaineering community. Not about blame, but about choices. In the years after the 2008 K2 disaster, climbers, journalists, and historians tried to understand what had happened during those chaotic hours high on the mountain. Different testimonies emerged. Photos taken from lower on the route helped reconstruct parts of the timeline. Sherpas and climbers who were still on the mountain shared what they had seen. Gradually, a clearer picture formed. Marco Confortola had descended believing the situation above him could not be solved quickly enough for everyone to survive. Exhausted, suffering from cold and altitude, he focused on reaching safety. Gerard McDonnell made a different choice. He stayed longer, continuing to work on the rope system and helping others free themselves before attempting to descend. Neither decision fits neatly into simple categories like hero or coward. Because at 8,000 meters, human judgment operates under conditions most people will never experience. The brain is starved of oxygen. The body is losing heat. The margin between survival and collapse becomes very thin. What remains are choices made in a place where normal rules no longer apply. Gerard McDonnell became remembered not just as the first Irish climber to reach the summit of K2, but as someone who, even in the death zone, continued trying to help others. Marco Confortola survived the mountain, but like many survivors of high-altitude disasters, he carried the weight of those events for the rest of his life, and K2 itself remained unchanged. The mountain did not judge the climbers. It did not reward courage or punish hesitation. Ice shifted, gravity acted, weather moved across the ridge. The same forces that have shaped that mountain for thousands of years. For climbers who study the history of K2, the lesson is simple but powerful. Preparation matters. Teamwork matters.
Judgment matters.
But in the highest places on Earth, uncertainty always remains. Because on K2, reaching the summit is optional. Is coming back alive is not.
Rigid yn agosol stories on it to Malayden, a community behind were stuck in bag of an extra rainability.
Stories like this, stories that explore the reality of high-altitude climbing and the difficult decisions made in extreme environments.
In K2’s and Sus. Well, stories like this, stories that explore the reality of high-altitude climbing and the difficult decisions made in extreme environments. In K2’s and to Cohent. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.